She arrived in the back of a cart. I know that is not how my counsel would tell it if they chose to tell it at all. They would say she arrived in the formal procession of the Ashford Border Pack, 3 elders, 2 packmates, a sealed treaty case, and the girl who was part of the terms. They would describe the horses, the banners, the snow on the North Road, as though ceremony makes a thing dignified that is not dignified at all. But I was at the upper window of the treaty hall when the procession came through the gate of Keswick Hold, and I saw her. She was sitting in the back of the flat cart, the one carrying the pack's offering chest and the winter provisions they had brought as a gift, because the Ashford elders were practical people who did not waste a cart space. She had her hands in her lap, and she was looking at my walls the way you look at a new road, not with fear, not with hunger, but with the steady attention of a person who intends to know where things are. That is the first thing I can say that is true about Marin of Ashford. She paid attention. Not the calculating kind, not the courtly kind where attention is a tool and the eyes are always counting what a thing is worth. She simply looked and saw and remembered. I would not understand what that meant for a very long time. At the time, I turned from the window and told my steward to show the Ashford party to the East Corridor, which was the corridor we used for minor treaty delegations. And I went back to the map table and the dispatch from the southern holds that had been waiting 3 days for my eye. I did not go to the formal greeting. I sent my second, Corin, who was good at formal greetings. I told myself this was efficient. A pack on the border of my eastern range had offered a daughter to seal a land-use agreement, grazing rights, passage fees, protection from the Murrin raiders who came through the passes in spring. It was not unusual. The girl was part of the terms the way the provisions were part of the terms, which is to say practically. I had agreed to the terms because the eastern range mattered and the border packs were useful, and I had not thought very hard about the girl at all. My wolf had been quiet for so long by then that I had stopped expecting anything from him. 22 years of war, of holding this mountain keep against every hand that thought the northern range was there for the taking, of losing men I trusted and watching men I thought I knew become different men when power moved close to them. 22 years of that does something to a wolf. He was still there. He still breathed. But he had stopped reaching for things the way he once had, and I had stopped asking him to. Corin came to find me that evening. He stood in the doorway of my study with the look he used when he had something to say that he did not think I wanted to hear, which was an expression I knew well. "The Ashford daughter," he said. "Is she settled?" "She is," he paused. "She asked where the records room was." I looked up from the dispatch. "She asked," Corin said carefully, "where you kept the territorial records, the land-use maps. She said she wanted to understand the terms she was part of." I sat back. In 17 years of treaty agreements, 11 of which had involved a person as part of the terms, as was custom in the northern packs, no one had ever asked to see the records. They had asked for better chambers, for a household, for a seat at the high table, for the ceremony date. Not one of them had asked to understand the terms. "Show her," I said. Corin blinked. "She asked honestly," I said. "Show her the records room, give her access to the territorial maps." I turned back to the dispatch. "She is part of the terms. She has a right to know what the terms say." I did not think about it again for 3 days. The records room was at the back of the keep's east wing, past the armory and the grain accounts. It was not a room anyone went to willingly. The shelves were organized in a system that my father's steward had devised and no one had improved upon since, which meant it worked but required a certain familiarity that took months to acquire. I used it at night sometimes when I could not sleep, because the smell of old parchment and the particular cold of stone shelving had become associated, for me, with a kind of useful quiet. I found her there on the 4th morning after her arrival. She was sitting on the floor beneath the 3rd shelf with a rolled map across her knees and 3 bound volumes open around her in a loose half-circle, and she was making notes in a small book she had brought herself. She looked up when I came in, and she did not startle, and she did not scramble to her feet in the fluttering way that people scrambled when they were unexpectedly in a room with me. She simply looked up. "The grazing lines on the Murrin boundary are wrong," she said. "The 43 survey ran the line 2 furlongs south of where the markers are now. There are 3 generations of Ashford families who have been grazing on land your records show as contested, but the survey says it's ours. That's why the Murrin raids increased 4 years ago. Someone in the Murrin pack found the old maps." I stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You've been here 4 days," I said. I read quickly. She turned a page in her notebook. If you correct the boundary line in your records and send a certified copy to the Murren pack leader with the 43 survey attached, you solve the raid problem without a military response. It would be cheaper. She paused. You could also get back 12 years of contested grazing fees if you chose. Though that might start a different argument. My wolf had gone still. Not the dead stillness of 22 years of silence, a different stillness, the kind that happens in the moment before something arrives. I had not felt it in so long that I almost didn't recognize it. Who taught you to read records? I said. My mother, she managed the Ashford Pack's land accounts for 30 years. Marin looked back at her notes. The elders sent me because I know the border surveys. They thought it would be useful to you. A short pause. I don't think they expected me to actually tell you. They thought you would be diplomatic. I'm not very good at diplomatic, she said, which was the most honest thing anyone in my keep had said to me in recent memory. I came into the room and looked at the map she had spread across her knees. She had marked the disputed boundary in charcoal lightly with the old survey line beside it in a different shade. The work was careful. She had a good eye. Leave those notes on my desk, I said. I'll have the boundary corrected and the packet sent to Murren before the month is out. She nodded. She did not thank me extravagantly. She did not look up to see if I was pleased. She just rolled the map back with methodical care and set it where she had found it. I left the records room and stood in the corridor for a moment, and my wolf shifted in a way he had not shifted in years. Not with urgency, not demanding anything, only turning, the way a sleeping animal turns toward warmth. I told myself it was nothing, a practical girl, a useful conversation. I was lying to myself, but I did not know it yet. My council did not think much of the Ashford bride. They did not say so outright. My council was too accomplished for that. But I had held Keswick for 22 years, and I knew every shade of what my council meant by what it did not say. Marin was given a seat at the lower end of the hall table at formal dinners, below the regional pack representatives, and above, just barely, the senior household staff. She was not assigned a household of her own. The treaty ceremony, which in our tradition would mark the formal completion of the arrangement and confer on her the standing of the Alpha Kings bonded, was discussed in my presence as something to schedule when the season allows, and the season was always allowing something else. I noticed. I said nothing, for reasons I was not then prepared to examine. What I told myself was that Marin had not asked for any of it. She made no complaint, sought no ally on my council, did not petition me through the channels that treaty brides had been known to use. She found work for herself. She reorganized the Eastern Range records and cross-referenced them against the past 30 years of dispute filings, a project my steward had meant to assign to someone for 2 decades. She quietly befriended the 2 youngest pack scouts who managed the Murren passes, because they were the ones who had actually walked the ground the old surveys described, and their knowledge was more current than any map. When the Murren response came, a formal acknowledgement of the corrected boundary line and an offer to negotiate the outstanding grazing fees, it was a result she had produced by sitting on the floor of my records room for 4 days. My council presented it at the hall meeting as the product of diplomatic strategy. They did not mention the girl at the end of the table. I watched her face. She showed nothing, and not because she was performing restraint. She genuinely did not seem to need the credit. She was already thinking about the next survey discrepancy she had found. That winter, I started taking the evening meal in the records room. It began as a practical thing. I told Corin there were documents I wanted to review, which was true, and it was more efficient to eat there, which was less true. The real thing, the thing I was not saying, was that the records room was the only place in my keep where someone would tell me what they actually thought. My council told me what was strategic. My regional pack leaders told me what served their range. The household told me what I was known to prefer. Marin sat on the floor with a land survey and told me when the numbers didn't match the ground, when a policy I had held for a decade was based on an error in the original data, when a thing I was certain of was only a thing I had been told so many times that I had stopped checking it. She was not unkind about any of it. She was precise. There is a difference. The toll structure on the South Pass, she said one evening in December without looking up from the volume she was reading, was set in the 31st year of your father's hold. The traffic patterns on the South Pass changed in the 44th year when the Murren raids made the East Road unsafe. The toll structure was never adjusted. You are currently charging past traffic at a rate that makes the South Pass less useful than the East Road, even without the raid risk. Your revenues from South Pass traffic have declined 40% in 8 years, and your records attribute it to the raids. The raids are solved now. The revenues will not recover until the toll structure is corrected. I put down my cup. How long have you known that? Since October, she turned a page. I assumed you had advisors who had told you. When they hadn't raised it by the end of the month, I thought I should. My whole council had sat with those revenue figures for 8 years and had not found the cause, or had found it and decided it was easier to attribute it to the raids, which were a simpler explanation and not their fault. A girl from the border who had been in my keep for 6 weeks had read the same figures and found the answer in a month. Thank you, I said. She looked up then, briefly, and there was something in her face, not surprise exactly, but a noticing, the way she had looked at my walls from the back of the cart, as though she was filing the information away for later. The ceremony, I said. It should have been scheduled before winter. Olive Corin set a date. She was quiet for a moment. You don't have to do that on my account. I'm doing it because it is overdue and because the terms should be properly completed. I paused. And because you have saved me a costly border dispute and 8 years of toll revenue errors in under 2 months. And the people responsible for those things have titles and households and a seat at the top of the table. She looked at the survey in her hands. I didn't come here to be rewarded. I know, I said. That is why it matters. My wolf had stopped being still. He was awake, not frantic, not desperate, the way wolves go when they feel the mate pull suddenly and do not know what to do with it. He was simply unmistakably oriented. Every hour I was in this room and every hour I was not, there was a direction now. It had the feeling of a compass settling after a long time of spinning. I had been refusing to name it for 2 months. I was still refusing. But I set the ceremony date. The ceremony itself was a quiet thing, which suited us both. My council attended because they were required to attend. The pack representatives came because it was the Alpha King's bonding ceremony and absence would have been noticed. They stood in the great hall with the formal expressions of people performing a necessary function, and Marin stood at my right hand in a gray wool dress that she had brought from Ashford, not because she lacked resources by then, but because she had not asked for anything else, and no one had thought to offer it, and the gray wool was plain and warm and entirely like her. I looked at her while the bonding words were spoken. She was watching the efficient with that steady attention she brought to things, the look that meant she was listening to understand, not to perform understanding. The fire in the hall grate was the only warm light. Her hands were folded in front of her. When the words reached the part where I was to speak, I spoke them. And my wolf, who had been awake and oriented for months, who had been patient in the way that only very certain things are patient, settled into something that was not stillness this time, but arrival. A warmth behind the ribs, like a fire that has been built properly from the right wood and will burn for as long as there is fuel. Marin turned and looked at me when I finished speaking. I'll be a useful partner to you, she said quietly, not the vow that was scripted. Just the truth of what she intended. I know, I said, which was also not the scripted answer. You already are. The council signed the formal record and filed out. The ceremony was complete. It was the least dramatic bonding in the history of Keswick Hold, which my council regarded as proof of how little consequence it was, and which I was beginning to understand was proof of the opposite. The second winter was different. I stopped telling myself that what I felt was practical. My wolf had stopped accepting that explanation months before and had simply been waiting for me to catch up. Marin had her own work, her own rhythm, her own judgments about what mattered and what was noise, and she did not ask me to adjust mine. But the keep had organized itself, the way a room reorganizes when the person who understands it starts moving things to their right places, and I found that I could think more clearly than I had in years. Not because she arranged my thoughts, she didn't touch my decisions unless I asked, but because one person in my life was telling me the truth, which had a clarifying effect on everything else. I began to ask her, not always about records and surveys. I had advisors for policy and commanders for war. What I asked Marin was the kind of thing you ask when you want to know what is actually happening, underneath the strategic framing and the careful presentation. What do you see in this man that the others don't want me to see? What does this decision look like from the border packs who have to live with it? Where am I wrong about this? She would think before answering. She never told me what I wanted to hear. She never sharpened her honesty into cruelty, either. She understood that there was a difference between truth spoken to be useful and truth spoken to diminish, and she kept clearly to the first. I had not had that in 22 years of holding Keswick. I had not known, until I had it, how much of my judgment had been working around the absence of it. By the second spring, I had stopped thinking of the records room as my private space and started thinking of it as ours. By the second summer, I had stopped arriving at the keep's formal functions and looking to the lower end of the table. Marin had been moved, without any particular decree, to the seat at my right hand, which was where the bonded Alpha Queen sat in every other keep in the northern range. No one on my council had formally arranged this. It had happened because it was the natural order of things, and the natural order had finally reasserted itself through sheer accumulated evidence. My council noticed they did not like it. I knew they did not like it. I had known for some time that there were members of my council for whom the question of who sat at my right hand was not a question of ceremony but of influence, whose voice reached mine most easily, whose interests were most protected, whose position was most secure. A treaty bride from the border who had no pack political ambitions and whose only loyalty was to honest accounting was, from this perspective, a problem. She could not be managed. She could not be offered an alliance. She had nothing she wanted, and people who want nothing are very difficult to use. What I did not know in the second summer was how far the problem had developed. The spring feast was Corin's idea, or was presented to me as Corin's idea, which I now understand is a different thing. It was a council feast, a tradition at Keswick going back to my father's time. All the regional pack leaders, the senior household, the treaty partners, gathered in the great hall for the formal review of the year's terms. It was, as all such feasts were, both a celebration and a reckoning, the kind of gathering where the important things were said in the margins, and the table conversations were where the real decisions happened. I had sat at the center of 31 of them. I knew how they worked. What I did not recognize, arriving at the hall that evening, was that this one had been set differently. The seating was wrong. Small differences, a redistribution of the place settings, certain faces in certain positions that were not where they usually sat, that individually meant nothing and together meant that the evening had been organized by someone with a specific outcome in mind. I saw it and filed it and chose not to react, because showing that you have seen a thing before the thing is attempted is how you lose the advantage of having seen it. Marin was at my right. She had been watching the room since we arrived. The feast began normally. The formal toasts, the review of the year's terms, the presentation of the range accounts. I ate. I spoke when spoken to. I watched the faces of the men I had led for 22 years and thought about what I had been too busy to think about clearly until Marin had made it possible to think clearly about anything. Torvin was my Lord Treasurer. He had been my father's Lord Treasurer before that, which meant he had held the position for 35 years, which meant his roots in the structure of my council went deeper than any other man there. He was the one who stood first, during the meal, in a moment between courses when the hall's conversation was at its lowest. The moment that anyone who had planned this would have identified as the right moment. He had a document in his hand. He said it was a petition from the regional pack leaders regarding the administration of the Eastern Range. He said the concerns were long-standing and deserved formal address. He said this with the careful neutrality of a man presenting something as procedural that was not procedural at all. I reached for the document. Marin's hand was already there. She had moved before I did, not dramatically, not with the gesture of someone throwing herself between two things. She simply picked the document up before I could reach it, the way she picked up a survey that interested her, and she opened it and began to read. The hall went quiet the way halls go quiet when something unexpected happens. Torvin looked at her. Several of my council members looked at each other. Marin read the document for a long moment. Then she set it down on the table in front of me, open, with her finger at a particular clause. Clause 9, she said to the hall. The petition requests that the Alpha King enter a formal review of all terms agreed within the last 5 years. Her voice was steady and quite clear. A formal review requires the Alpha King to present himself before the council without advisors. Clause 12 defines advisors to include the bonded Luna. She paused. Clause 15 grants the council authority to act on behalf of the hold if the Alpha King fails to appear within 3 days of the petition's submission. The hall was still. This petition, Marin said, is not about the Eastern Range. Torvin said, the Alpha Queen misreads the intent of a procedural document. She reads it correctly, I said. I said it quietly, the way I said things when I was certain and did not need volume. I looked at Torvin and then at each face around the table in turn. The men who had signed this, the men who had known it was coming, the men who had been surprised by it tonight because they had not been told. I could see the difference. It mattered. Then I looked at Marin, who was still sitting at my right hand with her hands folded in front of her, watching me with the same steady attention she had used the day she arrived and found the records room. You knew, I said, quietly for her. I suspected, she said, the seating arrangement, the timing of the courses. A pause. I read the past traffic accounts from the last 2 years. Torvin's range accounts don't match your independent records. Someone has been moving money for a while. She glanced at the document. I found it 3 days ago. I didn't know it would come to this tonight. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. You're telling me now, I said. She held my gaze. I'm always going to tell you, whatever it is. My wolf had been awake and oriented for 2 years. What happened in that moment was not the bond igniting. It had been lit for a long time, built slowly from charcoal marks on a land survey, and a girl who told me my toll structure was wrong and meant to help. What happened was the arrival of a thing I had been refusing to let all the way in. The certainty that she had walked into my hall with nothing she needed from me, and had stayed because she intended to, and had put herself between me and this document with no calculation behind it at all. Only the straightforward honesty that was the same as it had been the day she arrived. I stood up. The hall stood with me, the whole hall, the packmates, the household staff, the treaty representatives, the automatic response of 22 years of Keswick's custom. But the council members were slower. Torvin was last. Torvin, I said, you will remain. Your accounting records will be reviewed beginning tomorrow by the Lord Treasurer's office, which as of tomorrow morning will be under the direction of my bonded Luna, who has already demonstrated that she can find in a month what this council has misplaced for years. I looked at the rest of the table. The petition is withdrawn. The review will proceed of the Treasurer's accounts, not of my terms. I looked back at Marin, who was watching me with an expression that was not surprise and not satisfaction, which was exactly what I would have expected. She had not done this to be vindicated. She had done it because it needed doing, and she was the one who could. Come, I said, and I held out my hand. She took it without hesitation, which was also exactly what I would have expected, and her hand was warm and entirely familiar. The hand I had watched turn land surveys and bound volumes for 2 years. Small and capable and ink-stained at the first 2 fingers from the record's work, she still did herself instead of delegating it. We left the hall together. Behind us, I heard the particular quality of silence that a hall produces when it has understood something that will not be undone. I have held Keswick for 24 years now. Torvin's accounts, when reviewed, revealed 4 years of systematic misdirection of past revenues. Not to himself, precisely, but to a consortium of 3 regional pack leaders who had decided, some time ago, that the Northern Range would be better administered by a rotating council than by an Alpha King who refused to be managed. It was not the most sophisticated conspiracy I had ever dismantled. What made it dangerous was that I had not seen it coming, which was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of the particular kind of attention that tells you what is actually in the numbers, underneath the presentation of what you are supposed to see. Marin had seen it. She had seen it because she looked at things the way she looked at everything, not to verify what she already believed, but to find out what was there. Torvin resigned his post before the review concluded. The 3 pack leaders entered negotiations that resulted in a restructured range agreement that was, by every measure, more favorable to Keswick than the one they had sought to replace. Corin, who had not known about the petition and whose loyalty was genuine, and whose talent for formal greetings I had always valued, remained my second. He learned to knock before entering the records room. What changed in the keep was not dramatic. Marin did not preside over a court with a great fuss and an extensive household, which would have been her right. She had an assistant she chose herself, one of the past scouts, a young woman from the Murren border who had the same quality of attention she had. And she had the records room, which she eventually expanded by annexing the 2 storerooms adjacent to it. And she had her work, which was the work of knowing the truth of the hold's numbers and telling me when they diverged from what I was being told. She was also, in ways I could not have predicted and would not have thought to ask for, the reason I slept. Not because she arranged things for me, or soothed anything, or spoke comfort at the end of difficult days, though she was capable of all of those things and offered them without being asked when they were warranted. But because there was, finally, one place in my life where I did not have to hold myself ready for a thing to mean something other than what it appeared to mean. She was what she appeared to be. She had always been what she appeared to be. In 24 years of holding, a mountain keep against every hand that thought the northern range was there for the taking. That was the rarest thing I had encountered, and I had not known how much of my energy had gone into bracing against its absence until I no longer had to. My wolf slept, actually slept, the deep, satisfied sleep of a creature that has found what it was made to find and no longer has to keep watch for it. My counsel in subsequent years learned to read the hold's territorial and financial records themselves, or to have them read by someone who would find what was actually there. This was not a comfortable change for a number of them. It was a necessary one. Marin did not impose it by force or decree. She imposed it by being right, consistently, in front of everyone, until being right and being honest about the numbers became the operating assumption of the room. This is, I have come to believe, how things actually change, not by command, but by the sustained example of a person who does not know how to stop telling the truth. The hall still seats 72 at the annual council feast. Marin still sits at my right hand, where she has sat for 22 years. She still wears plain things, when given the choice, good wool, practical cuts, nothing that would slow her down in the records room. The ink stain on her first 2 fingers never entirely goes away. Last winter, one of the new regional pack representatives, a young leader from the southern range who had not been in the hall long enough to know our history, asked my steward who the woman at the Alpha King's right hand was. The Alpha Queen of Keswick, Corin told him. She doesn't look like, the young man started. She found a 4-year treasury fraud in 3 days, Corin said. She corrected a disputed boundary that was about to become a border war. She sat at the lower end of this table for the better part of a year because this council didn't think much of the treaty bride from the border, and she reorganized the Eastern Range records while she was waiting for someone to notice. A pause. She doesn't need to look like anything. She is what she is. The young man looked at her for a long moment. Then he bowed, which was the right response, and Corin said nothing more about it. That evening I told Marin what had been said. She considered it for a moment. Corin was generous, she said. Corin was accurate, I said. She was quiet for a while after that, the comfortable quiet of someone who does not need to fill a room with words, and the records room was warm and the fire had been built right, and my wolf was asleep. You know what I thought, I said eventually, when I saw you arrive. You weren't at the greeting, she said. I was at the upper window. I saw you in the cart. She looked at me. What did you think? I thought you were paying attention. I paused. I didn't think much else. I was wrong not to think more. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. You came to the records room. You told me the boundary line was wrong. It was wrong. Yes, I said. Everything you have told me has been true. In 24 years, I have not found one exception. She was quiet again. I want you to know that, I said, not because you need to be told. Because it is the most extraordinary thing I know, and I don't say enough of the things I know. She looked at me with the steady attention that had been the same since the day she arrived, not reading into it, not calculating it, just seeing what was there. You do well enough, she said. Outside the records room, the mountain keep was quiet, the north road dark, the passes closed for the season. The fire had been built from the right wood, and it would burn until morning. My wolf was at rest in the deep, settled way of a creature that has nothing left to watch for. I had given the whole of my reign looking for the thing that was actually there the whole time, in the back of a cart, looking at my walls. She had simply stayed and been true, and that had been enough, more than enough, to undo 24 years of useful treachery and build, at last, something honest in its place.